That's my wife's dog. He said it in the gravel lot outside the feed store in Baker City, Oregon, on a Tuesday in February, with his hand already halfway out toward her collar. And Ruby, 9 years old, blue heeler, deaf in one ear and about as friendly as a closed gate, walked straight over to him and put her head against his leg. I want you to understand that she does not do that. In 11 months, she had done that for exactly one person, and that person was me, and it took her 4 months. He crouched down and put both hands on either side of her face and said something to her I didn't hear. Then he stood up and looked at me properly and said, "Where did you get this dog?" And I said, "She was tied to my gate." He said, "When?" And I said, "The 14th of March." I watched that date go into him. I watched it land. He said, "Who are you?" And that is the question, isn't it? Because I knew exactly who he was. I'd known within about 9 seconds, and he had no idea who I was, and I had about 2 more seconds to decide whether to tell him. My name is Arlen Pike. I'm 48. I'm a farrier. I shoe horses, mostly on ranches out toward Halfway and Richland, which means I spend about 6 hours a day in a truck by myself, and the rest of it bent over somebody's gelding. It is a good job for a man who is not much good at people, and I want to be honest, that I chose it partly for that reason. The man in the gravel lot was Dale Ferris, 45. He runs a tire and alignment shop out on Campbell Street, and I'd been in it twice, and neither time had I said one word to him beyond what was on the invoice. His wife's name was Sylvie. And on the 13th of March last year, at about 11 at night, Sylvie Ferris sat in the cab of my truck outside the Elks Lodge and asked me to drive her to Boise on the Friday morning, and I said yes. She never showed. At about 5:30 on the Friday morning, I went out to load my truck, and there was a blue heeler tied to my gate with a length of orange baler twine and a note under the twine, and the note said 4 words, "Take care of her." That's what I had. That is the entire content of what I got. I looked for her for about 6 weeks, in the way a man looks for somebody when he has no right to be looking. I drove to Boise twice. I sat in a Denny's off Fairview for 2 hours on a Friday morning in April, for no reason I could explain to anybody. Then I stopped, and I kept a dog. Ruby did not want me. I want to be clear about that, because it's the only part of this that was straightforward. For 4 months, that animal ate what I put down, slept on the far side of whatever room I was in, and moved when I moved, always to the other side. She did not let me touch her head one single time. In July, she got into a coil of barbed wire behind the barn, and I had to carry her 140 yards to the truck. After that, she let me touch her head. That's the whole of my 11 months. A dog, a note with 4 words on it, and a very great deal of driving by myself with the radio off. And then her husband was standing 4 feet from me in a gravel lot asking me who I was. I told him, I want to be clear that I did not decide to. I want to be clear that if I'd had 11 months to think about it, I would probably have said, nobody, and got in my truck. But he was crouched down with his hands on that dog's face, and I heard myself say, "My name's Arlen Pike. I knew Sylvie a long time ago. She asked me to drive her to Boise and she never turned up, and she left that dog at my gate instead." He stood up very slowly, and he said, "You knew her a long time ago." I said, 1999 to 2001, before you. He said, "Were you?" And I said, "No." And then, because he needed more than that, I said, "Dale, I sat in a truck with her 4 times in about a year, and she talked and I listened. That's the whole of it. I'd have driven her to Boise, and I'd have driven home." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You're the first person I've talked to about her in 11 months who knows she's alive. We went to the Sumter Junction and sat in a booth for 3 hours, and neither of us ate anything. And what came out of that conversation is the reason I'm telling you any of this. If you're still with me, and I know this is where people decide whether they want the rest, do me one favor and hit subscribe. Because about halfway through that conversation, Dale asked me a direct question about what his wife had said about him, and what I did next is the thing I still turn over at 2 in the morning. Now, the booth. Here's what Sylvie told me, across 4 conversations in the cab of a truck. And before I give you the content, I want to give you the shape of it, because the shape is what got me. The first one was in the April, in the lot at the Chevron. I hadn't seen her in 22 years. She came over because she recognized the truck, my name's on the door, and we talked for maybe 40 minutes about absolutely nothing. Who was dead, who'd moved. She was funny. I'd forgotten that about her. The second one was in July, and it lasted about an hour and a quarter, and she cried at the end of it for maybe 90 seconds, and then apologized 4 times. The third one was in November, and that's when she started giving me things I could hold. She said Dale went through her phone. She said he'd stopped her going to her sister's in Ontario twice. She said there'd been a night in the January where she'd slept in her car in the lot behind the Safeway, and he hadn't asked where she'd been. She never said he hit her. I want to be precise, because it matters. She never once said that, and I never asked, and I built a picture anyway out of everything around the edges of what she did say. And that's the shape. Nothing in one go. Nothing you could write down and take to anybody. Just a thing every few months, each one a little heavier, each one arriving after enough of a gap that you'd been sitting with the last one on your own. By March, I would have driven that woman anywhere on this earth and not asked her a single question, and I want to be honest that I felt good about that. I felt like a man who was finally useful. Then I sat in that booth looking at a 45-year-old man who had lost about 30 pounds since March, and I thought, I don't know one single thing here that I actually know. Then Dale said, "Can I ask you something and you tell me the truth?" I said, "Okay." He said, "What did she say about me?" And I told him. All of it. The phone, the sister, the night in the Safeway lot. I said it flat, no softening, in about 90 seconds, and I watched what it did to his face, and I did not stop. He sat there, and then he said, and this is the part I'd give a lot to be able to unhear. He said, "The night behind the Safeway was the 6th of January, and I was in Boise at my mother's, and she knew I was, because she drove me to the bus." He said, "I've never touched her phone. She didn't have a passcode on it. It sat on the counter." And he said, "Her sister in Ontario has been dead since 2019. I want to be careful here, because there is an easy version of this story, and it is not true. The easy version is that Sylvie Ferris was a liar, and Dale was a good man, and I was a fool. Dale is not a saint. He told me that himself, over about the next hour. He said he'd been at that shop 6 days a week for 19 years. He said he had not asked his wife a real question since about 2018. He said there was a period in 2021 where she asked him 3 separate times to go somewhere with her, Bend, the coast, anywhere, and he said no 3 times because of the shop, and that he thinks about that more than anything else. He said, "I wasn't cruel to her, I just wasn't there, and I've had 11 months to work out whether those are actually different. But the sister was dead, and I was in Boise on the 6th of January. Those 2 things are just facts." In April, Dale found the other one. He'd been going through a box of her paperwork looking for a title, and he found a divorce decree from Humboldt County, Nevada, dated 2006. Sylvie had been married before. Winnemucca, a man named Ross Kelleher. Dale drove down there in May, 8 hours. And he found him, and Ross Kelleher is now 58 years old and runs a parts counter, and Dale sat with him for one afternoon. Same thing. Almost exactly the same thing. She'd told a man at Ross's church that Ross was frightening her. She'd arranged for that man to drive her to Reno. And on the morning she was supposed to go, she left, alone, and she left a cat with the man from the church. Not the same story. The same shape. Exactly the same shape. Dale called me from a parking lot in Nevada that night, and he did not say hello. He said, "Arlen, she has to be escaping. She can't just go. She has to be running from something or she can't make her legs work." And I sat on my porch in Baker City with a blue heeler at my feet, and I understood something that I have not been able to get past since. She wasn't lying to hurt us. She was building a door, and a door needs a wall to be in, and Dale was the wall, and Ross Kelleher was the wall before him, and if she'd stayed another 4 years, then I would have been the wall after. I got the easy part. I was the driver. That's the only reason I get to sit here sounding reasonable about it, because she left before I had a chance to become the thing she needed me to be. There is one more piece and then I'll stop. The dog had a bad hip when she came to me. I'd been taking her to a clinic on 10th Street about every 6 weeks for the better part of a year. A vet named Bree Ostland, who is 37, and who I had, in 11 months, entirely failed to have a single conversation with that wasn't about a dog's hip. In November I told her the whole thing, because by then I was telling anybody who stood still. And she went quiet, and then she said, "Wait." And she went and looked something up. In October, a woman had called that clinic. No name. Wouldn't leave one. She asked whether they had a blue heeler named Ruby on their books and whether the hip had been dealt with. And when the girl on reception asked who was calling, she hung up. October. 7 months after she went. That's what we've got. That's the whole of it. She's alive, she was somewhere with a phone, and the only thing on this earth she has checked on is the dog. Dale took that harder than anything, and I understand why, and I've never said the thing I actually think, which is that it might have been easier for her to ask about a dog than about a man. I don't know if that's true. I offer it because he's my friend now, and I'd like it to be true for him. That was 3 years ago in March. Dale sold the shop in the spring, and he's still here, which surprised everybody, including him. He comes out to my place the first Sunday of the month and sits on my porch, and Ruby lies on his feet for about 2 hours, and neither of us says a great deal. She's 12 now. The hip is the hip. She has good days. We do not look for Sylvie. We talked about it exactly once, in the second year, and Dale said, if she's out there being all right, and if we found her, we'd only be another wall. And then he said, and I'd have to hear what she says about me now, and that ended it. Bree asked me to dinner in the January, which I want on record, because I would not have. She said she'd been waiting 11 months for me to work out that a dog's hip does not need a 6-week recheck. It's been 2.5 years. She has a 9-year-old and a house with a red door, and she is the single most direct person I have ever met, which after Sylvie is not an accident, and both of us know it. One last thing. Dale Ferris looked me in the face in a booth at the Sumter Junction and asked me what his wife had said about him, and I told him all of it in 90 seconds without softening one word. Some people tell me that was the right thing, that he'd spent 11 months not knowing why his life ended, and that a man is owed the truth about his own marriage even when it's ugly, and that everything good that came after came out of that 90 seconds. Other people tell me I handed a broken man a set of accusations from a woman who was not there to be asked about them, and that I did it because I wanted to get it out of my own chest, and that he has to carry the 6th of January now for the rest of his life. So settle it for me in the comments, because he and I have never once discussed it. Should I have told him what she said, or should I have taken it home with me? And if you sat through all of that with me, subscribe. There's a new one every week, and every single one of them is about somebody who found out too late what they were actually being used for. Thanks for sitting with me.